The terrifying beauty of ego death. When I disappears, have you ever had a moment where you looked in the mirror and didn't recognize yourself? Not physically, but something deeper. You see your face, your eyes, but the person looking back feels like a stranger. Who is this? What happened to the me I thought I was? It's a disturbing question, one that most of us quickly push away. We need that sense of I to function, to navigate the world, to know where we end and others begin. But what if that very sense of self, the one you've spent your entire life constructing and defending, is actually a prison? What if the walls you've built to protect your identity are the same walls that keep you from experiencing the fullness of existence? There's a phenomenon that mystics, psychologists, and philosophers have explored for millennia, something that terrifies and liberates in equal measure. It's called ego death, the complete dissolution of the sense of self, the moment when I disappears entirely. And here's the paradox that we'll explore today. In losing yourself, you might finally find yourself. In the death of who you think you are, something truer is born. This isn't comfortable spiritual wisdom. This is the terror and beauty of transformation at its most fundamental level, the death and rebirth that happens not to your body, but to the very center of your subjective experience. Let's start with something most of us can recognize. You're living your life, following the script that was handed to you, or that you wrote for yourself years ago. You have an identity, a name, a role, a set of characteristics that define you. Perhaps you're the reliable one, the creative one, the analytical one. Maybe you're defined by your career, your relationships, your achievements. This identity feels solid, real, permanent. But then something cracks. Maybe it's a crisis, a divorce, a job loss, a death, an illness. Or maybe it's subtler, a growing sense of emptiness that no accomplishment can fill. You start to notice that the person you present to the world feels increasingly like a performance. You catch yourself saying things you don't mean, doing things that don't align with something deeper inside you. The mask you wear, and you may not have even realized it was a mask, starts to feel suffocating. I remember speaking with someone who described it perfectly. She was a successful attorney, respected in her field, living what everyone would call the dream. But she told me that every morning, getting dressed for work felt like putting on armor. I would look at my reflection, she said, and think, who is this person? I knew how to be the attorney. I'd been doing it for 15 years, but I had no idea who I actually was underneath all of that. This is the beginning of what can become ego death, the recognition that the self you've constructed might not be your true self at all. But recognizing this creates a terrifying problem. If you're not who you think you are, then who are you? And here's where it gets even more unsettling. What if there's no solid, permanent you at all? What if the very foundation you've built your entire existence upon is an illusion? Most people, when they hit this realization, pull back immediately. The existential vertigo is too much. We desperately reinforce our identity, double down on who we think we are. We get busier, we chase more achievements, we strengthen our persona. Because the alternative, letting that sense of self dissolve, feels like death itself, and in a way it is. The conventional wisdom tells us to find ourselves, to discover who we really are, as if there's a true, fixed self waiting to be uncovered like a treasure buried in sand. We're told to be confident in our identity, to know ourselves, to be authentic. But what if authenticity isn't about finding a better, truer version of the self? What if it's about seeing through the illusion of self entirely? This creates an almost unbearable tension. We need a sense of self to function in the world. We need to say, I want this. I believe that. I am this type of person. Without that organizing principle, how do we make decisions? How do we relate to others? How do we know what to do when we wake up in the morning? Yet simultaneously, that very sense of self creates suffering. It creates separation. Me versus you, me versus the world, me versus the person I wish I was. It creates attachment to being a certain way, which means resistance to change, to growth, to the natural flow of life. The ego desperately tries to maintain its boundaries, to stay intact, to survive. And in that desperate grasping, we miss something essential. Consider how much energy you expend maintaining your sense of self. Think about it. How much mental effort goes into protecting your self-image, defending your beliefs, maintaining your narrative about who you are? How often do you feel hurt when someone contradicts your self-concept? How much do you suffer when reality doesn't align with your identity? The I you defend so fiercely, is it protecting you or imprisoning you? This is the mystery we're confronting. The very thing that seems most fundamentally you might be the primary source of your suffering. And the solution, ego death, sounds like annihilation. Carl Jung understood this paradox deeply. He spent his life exploring the psyche's depths, and what he discovered was both unsettling and liberating. Jung recognized that what we call the ego, that conscious sense of I, is actually a tiny fragment of who we are. It's like a small island of consciousness floating in a vast ocean of the unconscious. The ego, in Jung's framework, isn't your enemy. It's necessary for functioning in the world. But the problem arises when the ego mistakes itself for the totality of who you are. Jung called this ego inflation, when the conscious ego identifies itself as the whole psyche and tries to run the entire show. It's like the president of a company thinking they're the entire corporation, ignoring all the departments, workers, and systems that actually make things function. What Jung termed the shadow is everything the ego rejects about itself. These are the parts of your psyche that don't fit the image you've constructed. Maybe you see yourself as kind, so your capacity for cruelty goes into the shadow. Maybe you identify as rational, so your emotional depths are repressed. The shadow contains not just negative qualities. It also holds unrealized potential, gifts you've denied because they didn't fit your self-concept. Here's what's fascinating. The shadow doesn't disappear just because you ignore it. It operates autonomously, influencing your behavior in ways you don't recognize. You project it onto others, seeing in them the qualities you can't acknowledge in yourself. You sabotage yourself in inexplicable ways. The shadow speaks through your dreams, your slips of the tongue, your inexplicable emotional reactions. Jung described the process of individuation as the journey toward wholeness, not perfection, but completeness. This requires confronting the shadow, which means facing everything about yourself that you've spent years avoiding. It means ego death in a very real sense because it requires dying to your idealized self-image. But individuation goes deeper than shadow work. Jung spoke of the persona, the social mask we wear, the face we present to the world. The persona isn't false, exactly. It's necessary. You need different personas for different contexts. But problems arise when you identify completely with your persona, when you forget it's a role you're playing and believe it's who you actually are. Remember that attorney I mentioned? She had completely identified with her persona. The competent, articulate, professional mask had become her entire sense of self. When she started to question it, she experienced what felt like an identity crisis. But Jung would say this wasn't a crisis. It was the beginning of individuation, the psyche's compensation mechanism trying to restore balance. The psyche, Jung discovered, has its own intelligence. It's self-regulating. When the ego becomes too one-sided, too inflated, too identified with only one aspect of being, the unconscious compensates. It sends dreams, symptoms, synchronicities, messages designed to expand consciousness beyond its current limitations. What we experience as crisis, Jung would see as the psyche trying to heal itself. This is where ego death enters the Jungian framework. True individuation requires what Jung called the death and rebirth of the ego. The ego must die to its sense of sovereignty, must recognize it's not the master of the psyche. This doesn't mean the ego disappears entirely. That would be psychosis. Rather, the ego shifts from being the king to being the servant of something larger that Jung called the self with a capital S. The self, in Jung's terminology, is the totality of the psyche, conscious and unconscious together. It's the center and circumference of your being. The ego is contained within the self, not the other way around. Individuation is the process of the ego learning to align with the self, to serve the wholeness of the psyche rather than maintaining its own limited perspective. Jung described the self using symbols from various traditions: the mandala, the divine child, the philosopher's stone. These images appear spontaneously in dreams and visions during the individuation process, pointing toward an organizing center that transcends the ego. The self represents paradoxical unity, the integration of all opposites, the reconciliation of conscious and unconscious, persona and shadow, masculine and feminine principles. This process isn't gentle. Jung called it active imagination, a deliberate practice of engaging with unconscious contents, allowing figures from dreams and fantasies to speak, listening to aspects of yourself you've silenced. It requires the ego to surrender its defensive posture, to become vulnerable to the unknown depths within. The collective unconscious adds another dimension to this. Jung proposed that beneath the personal unconscious lies a layer shared by all humanity, archetypal patterns, primordial images, the psychological inheritance of the species. Ego death, in this context, isn't just personal. It's the recognition that your individual ego is a temporary formation arising from something vastly older and larger than your personal history. When the ego begins to relativize itself, when it recognizes it's not the center of the psyche, but a small part of something incomprehensibly vast, this is ego death in the Jungian sense. It's terrifying because the ego experiences it as annihilation, but it's also liberating because in releasing its grip, space opens for the self to emerge. Jung understood that this process follows the archetypal pattern of death and rebirth found in every mythology and religion. The hero must descend to the underworld. The initiate must die symbolically to be reborn. Christ must be crucified before resurrection. This isn't metaphor. It's describing the actual psychological process of transformation where the old structure of consciousness must dissolve for a new structure to emerge. What makes this particularly challenging is that you can't force ego death through willpower. The ego can't kill itself. That's a logical impossibility. Instead, transformation happens through surrender, through allowing the dissolution rather than causing it. Jung called this letting things happen, an active passivity that's completely contrary to the ego's natural stance of control. Beyond Jung, philosophers and mystics across traditions have grappled with this dissolution of self. Friedrich Nietzsche spoke of it in terms of the death of God and the Übermensch, the person who creates meaning in a world stripped of absolute truths. For Nietzsche, ego death meant the destruction of all inherited values and identities, requiring the individual to become who they truly are through radical self-overcoming. But here's Nietzsche's crucial insight. This self-overcoming isn't arriving at a final, fixed identity. It's perpetual becoming, continuous transformation. The moment you think you've found yourself, you've already begun to fossilize. True freedom means remaining fluid, willing to die and be reborn repeatedly. In Eastern philosophy, particularly Buddhism, ego death is the entire point of the spiritual path. The Buddha taught that the self is anatta, not self, a fiction, an illusion created by the mind's tendency to grasp and identify. The suffering we experience, dukkha, arises directly from this false identification with a separate, permanent self. Buddhist meditation practices are essentially ego death technologies. You sit and observe your thoughts, emotions, sensations, and you notice. None of these is you. Thoughts arise and pass. Emotions come and go. Even the sense of being the one who observes eventually dissolves. What remains? Buddhists might say emptiness, or Buddha nature, not a void, but a fullness beyond conceptual understanding. The Hindu tradition offers similar insights through Advaita Vedanta. The individual self, the jiva, is understood as a limited manifestation of Brahman, the absolute reality. Enlightenment comes through recognizing tat tvam asi, thou art that. The wave realizes it's the ocean. The drop understands it's the water. This realization is ego death, not the extinction of consciousness, but the expansion of identity beyond its narrow boundaries. Soren Kierkegaard, the Christian existentialist, approached this from yet another angle. He described the sickness unto death, despair arising from the self's inability to be itself, or its desperate attempt to be itself without grounding in something beyond itself. Kierkegaard saw authentic existence as requiring a leap of faith, a surrender of the autonomous ego to something transcendent. This surrender is a kind of death of the self-sufficient ego, but it opens the possibility of authentic selfhood. Martin Heidegger contributed the concept of Das Man, the they-self. We lose ourselves in what they say, what they do, conforming to social expectations and norms, living inauthentically. Heidegger's notion of being toward death, an authentic existence arising from acknowledging our mortality, implies a kind of ongoing ego death, a continuous recognition that the self is not a thing but a possibility, a project perpetually incomplete. What emerges across these philosophical traditions is a paradox. The self is both real and unreal, both necessary and illusory. We can't function without some sense of I, yet that very sense creates the primary barrier to truth, freedom, and authentic existence. The solution isn't strengthening or finding a better self. It's seeing through the self while paradoxically still living as a self. Consider the Taoist perspective. The Tao Te Ching teaches that the sage acts through wu-wei, effortless action, non-doing. This doesn't mean passivity. It means action that flows from alignment with the Tao rather than from ego-driven striving. The ego's plans, its desperate attempts to control outcomes, its attachment to particular results, all of this dissolves in favor of spontaneous, appropriate response to each moment. The Sufi tradition in Islam speaks of fana, annihilation of the ego in the divine presence. The mystic dies to their separate self, realizing that only God truly exists. But this isn't nihilistic. It's experienced as union, as finding one's true identity in the beloved. The ego's death reveals its never having been truly separate. Western philosophy also grappled with this through phenomenology. Edmund Husserl's transcendental ego and Maurice Merleau-Ponty's embodied consciousness point toward a self that's not a thing but a process, not an entity but a field of experience. The I is the activity of experiencing, not something behind or beyond experience. These philosophical frameworks converge on a stunning realization. Consciousness without a fixed self is not only possible, but perhaps more fundamental than the self concept we cling to. The terror of ego death stems from mistaking ourselves for the narrative, the concept, the image when actually we're the awareness in which all narratives arise and dissolve. But here's where it gets philosophically interesting. If there's no fixed self, who's asking the question? Who's exploring these ideas? This is the recursive paradox at the heart of ego death. The seeker is the sought. The question contains its own answer. The ego trying to transcend itself is like a knife trying to cut itself or an eye trying to see itself. Some philosophers suggest this means ego death can't be achieved, only realized to have already occurred. You're not trying to reach a state of no self. You're recognizing that the solid, separate self was never there to begin with. It's not a future achievement, but a present fact obscured by conceptual overlay. This challenges our entire framework of personal development and spiritual growth. We think we're going somewhere, becoming something, achieving a state. But what if transformation isn't accumulation, but subtraction? Not adding something new, but removing the false, the constructed, the unnecessary. Not becoming enlightened, but recognizing the light that was never obscured except by the attempt to possess it. The existential implications are profound. If the self is fluid, constructed, ultimately empty of inherent existence, then all the meanings we attach to things, all our judgments about good and bad, success and failure, worthy and unworthy, these too are revealed as provisional, created, changeable. This can feel like nihilism, like nothing matters. But paradoxically, it can also mean everything matters precisely because we're free to engage with life directly, without the filter of rigid self-concept. So how does this show up in actual life? What does the process of ego death look like as it unfolds in ordinary existence? It's rarely a single dramatic event, though it can be more often. It's a gradual dissolution, a slow awakening from the dream of who you thought you were. You might notice it first as a growing dissonance between your inner experience and outer expression. The things you used to find meaningful start to feel hollow. Achievements that once mattered no longer satisfy. Relationships based on your persona feel increasingly burdensome. There's a restlessness, a sense that something essential is missing, though you can't name what. This is the beginning of what Jung called the encounter with the shadow, and it's deeply uncomfortable. You start seeing aspects of yourself you've denied. Perhaps you've always identified as a good person, and suddenly you're confronted with your capacity for selfishness, for cruelty, for pettiness. The ego wants to reject this to maintain its self-image, but something in you knows that real growth requires acknowledging the whole truth. The first step is recognizing that discomfort as information rather than a problem to solve. Your psyche is trying to expand beyond its current limitations. The crisis isn't a sign that something's wrong. It's a sign that something's trying to become more whole. This reframe alone can shift your relationship with the experience. When you begin to see through your persona, when you recognize that the roles you play aren't who you fundamentally are, there's often a period of confusion. Who am I if I'm not my job title, my relationship status, my accomplishments? This is destabilizing. The ego experiences it as threat. You might feel depressed, anxious, lost. This is normal. This is the dark night of the soul that mystics have described for centuries. During this phase, certain practices become essential. First, developing the capacity to observe your own mind without complete identification with its contents. This is what meditation cultivates: a witnessing awareness that can hold thoughts and emotions without being swept away by them. You learn to notice, there's a thought saying I'm worthless, rather than I am worthless. Second, engaging with the symbolic realm through dreams, art, or active imagination. The unconscious speaks in images and symbols, not in rational propositions. When you give attention to your dreams, when you allow yourself to create without censorship, you're creating space for aspects of the psyche that the rational ego has silenced. Third, finding what Jungians call Taminos a sacred space, either physical or psychological, where transformation can occur safely. This might be a therapist's office, a meditation cushion, a journal, or time in nature. Somewhere you can let the defenses down, allow what's emerging to emerge. You might also notice synchronicities, increasing meaningful coincidences that seem too perfect to be random. Jung saw these as signs that the psyche is reorganizing at a deep level, that the barrier between inner and outer is becoming more permeable. The universe seems to be responding to your inner process, but here's the practical challenge: you still have to function in the world. You have bills to pay, relationships to navigate, responsibilities to meet. How do you do this while undergoing ego death? The answer isn't to abandon everything and retreat to a cave, though that impulse may arise. Rather, it's to hold both realities simultaneously. You continue to use the ego, to operate through personas, but with awareness that these are tools, not your totality. You play the role of employee, parent, friend, but you don't forget it's a role. There's a quality of playfulness that can emerge, a lightness, even while taking your responsibilities seriously. You're in the world, but not entirely of it. This process naturally involves grief. You're mourning the death of who you thought you were, the loss of the certainty you once had. Let yourself grieve. Don't rush to the next identity, the next certainty. There's wisdom in the liminal space, in the not knowing. Jung called this holding the tension of opposites, resisting the urge to collapse into one side or the other, staying in the fertile void where transformation occurs. Practically, this might mean saying no to things that once defined you. It might mean allowing relationships that were based on your old identity to change or end. It might mean making choices that seem inexplicable to others because they're coming from a deeper place than ego-driven goals. You'll encounter resistance from others and from yourself. The ego doesn't surrender willingly. It will create every conceivable argument for why this process is dangerous, foolish, unnecessary. It will convince you that you're just being self-indulgent, that you need to get over yourself and return to normal functioning. These are the death throes of an identity structure fighting for survival. The key is recognizing this resistance while not being controlled by it. You don't have to believe every thought the ego produces. You can acknowledge the fear while continuing the process of opening, dissolving, becoming more transparent to yourself. And then, sometimes gradually, sometimes suddenly, something shifts. The fear of dissolution begins to transform into something else, not exactly peace, perhaps, but a kind of spaciousness. The death you were terrified of turns out not to be annihilation, but expansion. You discover that losing the fixed sense of self doesn't mean losing the capacity to function. It means functioning more freely, more spontaneously, more appropriately to each situation. Without a rigid identity to defend, you become more responsive to what each moment requires. You're less predictable, more alive, more present. The paradox resolves itself in experience, though never completely in concept. You realize you're simultaneously no one and everyone, nothing and everything. The boundaries that seemed so solid between self and other, inner and outer, conscious and unconscious, reveal themselves as permeable, fluid, ultimately conceptual rather than absolute. What emerges is what Jung called the self with a capital S. Not the ego, but the totality of the psyche finding its center. You're no longer identified solely with consciousness, with the persona, with any particular aspect. Instead, there's an awareness that can hold all aspects, all contradictions, all the multitudes you contain. This doesn't mean you've achieved some final state of enlightenment. Integration is ongoing, continuous, never complete. But there's a fundamental shift in the center of gravity. The ego is no longer the master, but the servant. Consciousness is no longer trapped in a small, defended corner of being, but has access to the full range of the psyche. You might notice that life becomes simultaneously more serious and less serious. More serious because you're engaging with the depths, with what truly matters, rather than surface-level concerns. Less serious because you're not taking yourself, concept so seriously anymore. There's humor in recognizing the elaborate games the ego plays. Relationships change profoundly. Without the desperate need to maintain a particular image, you can be more authentic. Without the constant comparison and competition that comes from ego identification, you can genuinely celebrate others. You're less reactive because triggers that once threatened your self-image no longer have the same charge. Creativity often flourishes after ego death because you're no longer censoring yourself through the filter of who I am. Ideas, expressions, and possibilities that the ego would have rejected as not me can now emerge. The artist who worried about maintaining their style might discover new forms. The thinker trapped in familiar patterns might have genuinely original insights. But here's what's crucial to understand. This transformation doesn't mean the end of suffering or the arrival at permanent bliss. You still experience pain, loss, disappointment, but your relationship with these experiences changes. They're no longer threats to your identity, but simply aspects of being alive, waves in the ocean of consciousness that you are. There's a quality that might be called groundlessness or not knowing that becomes comfortable, even welcome. Without the false security of a fixed identity, you're more open to mystery, to surprise, to the genuine unpredictability of existence. This is both humbling and liberating. The courage this requires cannot be overstated. To allow the dissolution of your sense of self, to not know who you are, to stay in the void while a new structure of consciousness forms. This is perhaps the most courageous act a human being can undertake. It goes against every survival instinct, every societal conditioning, every voice that says, hold on, maintain control, stay safe. So we return to where we began, that moment of looking in the mirror and not recognizing yourself. But now, perhaps, that moment holds different possibilities. What if the stranger in the mirror isn't a problem to solve, but an invitation to discover? What if not recognizing yourself is the first step toward authentic recognition? The terrifying beauty of ego death is this. In losing what you thought you were, you gain access to what you actually are, something far more vast, more mysterious, more alive than any concept of self could contain. The I that disappears was always a construction, a useful fiction that served its purpose, but ultimately became a cage. What remains when the ego dies isn't nothing, it's everything. It's the consciousness that was always there, no longer confined to a narrow identity, no longer defending itself against life. It's the awareness in which all experiences arise, the space in which all phenomena appear and disappear. This isn't a comfortable teaching. It won't make you more successful, more likable, more secure in conventional terms. It might actually make your life more challenging in some ways because you'll no longer be able to live unconsciously, automatically, according to scripts inherited or absorbed. But what it offers is something that no achievement, no relationship, no external validation can provide. The possibility of authentic existence, of living from your actual depths rather than your constructed surface. It offers freedom, not from responsibility or difficulty, but from the prison of a fixed, defended, narrow sense of who you must be. The process is ongoing. Even after profound ego-death experiences, the ego reconstructs itself. This is natural, even necessary. But each time, you see through it more quickly. Each time, the identification is less complete. Each time, there's more space, more freedom, more capacity to be who you are in each moment without being enslaved to who you were. So the question isn't whether you'll experience ego death. If you're paying attention to your life, you already are, in small and large ways. The question is whether you'll resist it or surrender to it, whether you'll experience it as annihilation or liberation. The journey into the depths of your own being, the confrontation with everything you've hidden from yourself, the dissolution of your most cherished certainties about who you are. This is the hero's journey of our time, not out in the world conquering external dragons, but inward, facing the dragon of your own ego, your own shadow, your own constructed self. And in that confrontation, in that death, something is born that couldn't exist before, not a better you, not a fixed enlightened self, but consciousness discovering its own nature, awareness, recognizing itself, experiencing itself without the distortion of a rigid identity structure. The terrifying beauty of ego death is that it's both an ending and a beginning, both a loss and a gain, both death and birth. It's the transformation that can't be explained until it's experienced, and once experienced, can't be adequately explained. It's the open secret at the heart of every genuine spiritual tradition, every depth psychology, every philosophy that has the courage to look directly at the nature of consciousness and self. Your defenses against this process, your resistance to dissolution, your attempts to maintain control, these are understandable, natural, and ultimately futile. Life itself is the force that dissolves all fixed structures, including the structure of self. The question is only whether you'll fight this process every step of the way or learn to dance with it, to surrender to it, to allow it to transform you into something more true, more whole, more alive than the defended ego could ever be. The invitation stands always. The door is always open. The death that leads to life, the dissolution that leads to wholeness, the terrifying beauty of ego death, it's waiting not in some future achievement or distant enlightenment, but in this very moment, in the willingness to let go of who you think you are, and discover what remains when all the constructions fall away.